much, Susan and Dr. Wilson, and I'm very happy to be here today. We start with a few thanks. First of all, thanks to Dr. Wilson for inviting me, and more importantly, for actually teaching me a lot about these three counties in Maryland and about this very fine institution. I'm a resident of Maryland, a different part of Maryland, but it's been very informative for me to learn more about this area and how the college interacts with the region. Thanks also to Susan for very helpful comments, insightful comments. And thanks also to the CSM leadership and staff, Davis, Angie, and others that have facilitated my visit here today. So it's great to be here. Let's see if I can work. There we go. There. There's three things that I'd like to do in my talk today. First of all, I want to focus on what do we actually mean by upward mobility. And my focus is going to be a little more economic, whereas Susan's was more social. What are the definitions of upward mobility? How do we measure it, et cetera, borrowing heavily from Professor Raj Chetty at Harvard and his organization Opportunity Insights. And secondly, I will dive into the data from Chetty, from the Census Bureau, and others on these three counties, and what those data show us about mobility. And then third, I'm only going to focus on community colleges. What does the research tell us about the challenges people face, students face who go to community colleges in terms of access, momentum, and mobility? And then what are the implications for policy and practice? Now, I want to say at the outset, on some of these topics, certainly about what's going on here in these three counties and what's going on in this institution, all of you know more than I do, clearly. I'm going to give you the view from 10,000 feet and from the research literature. But then we'll have time at the end to actually have a conversation, which I'm hoping is really 2 hours. I want to learn from you about what you see here on the ground, what you see in this institution, and then maybe we can inform each other as we move ahead. So let me start with the definition of absolute versus relative mobility. There are two different definitions. Absolute mobility is simply the idea with each passing generation are people doing better than their parents and their grandparents, et cetera. And it's really a reflection of whether we have widely shared prosperity. President John F. Kennedy, back in the early 60s, very famously said, a rising tide lifts all boats, with the view that if you have economic growth and it's widely shared, everybody's going to rise together. And that was actually true in that economy at that point in time. We had strong economic growth and it was widely shared across all parts of the income distribution. Relative mobility is a different concept. Relative mobility is you're not comparing people to their parents, you're comparing people to each other. And you line everybody up in terms of percentiles from 0 to 100, where you fall in what we call the income distribution. And to what extent, wherever you are in the income distribution, how does that compare to where your parents were? And if you're doing better in a relative sense than your parents were, if they were at the 20th percentile and you're at the 50th, you're making relative progress, relative mobility as well as absolute. And I'll tell you in advance, if you have a society with high absolute mobility, and we've had a few periods in the last 30 years when we've experienced that, in the second half of the 1990s, the US economy right before the pandemic, there was broadly shared growth. It was lifting everybody. And people felt good about that. They worried less about the relative comparisons. But mostly in the last 40 years, we haven't had broadly shared prosperity. Too much of the prosperity has gone to the very top. And in that situation, these relative comparisons then become a lot more important. And so we'll talk about both kinds of mobility. Now I'm going to introduce sort of 4 facts about mobility in America that come out of a lot of that research by Chetty and his colleagues. So the first fact is that absolute mobility has declined over time. Compared to our parents, we are not making nearly as much progress as earlier generations were. And secondly, that relative status, where people fall in the distribution relative to other people, does depend quite heavily on their parents' income, which flies in the face of what we usually call equal opportunity. Right? If opportunity is truly equal, where you end up wouldn't matter so much, wouldn't depend so much on your parents. We haven't reached equal opportunity yet. Thirdly, upward mobility depends very heavily on race and gender. And fourth, upward mobility does vary with geography. So let me show you a chart about each of those facts. So this is the chart about absolute mobility, the fraction of people who make more than their parents did at a certain age, comparing apples to apples. You can see for the cohorts born in the 1940s, 1950s, we were almost guaranteed to make more than our parents did. We had widely shared prosperity. Look, this is a disturbing chart. By the time you get to people born in the 70s and 80s, you only have about a 50-50 chance of doing better than your parents. And you know, if you don't have at least a BA and maybe even a graduate degree, it's less likely that happens. So our level of absolute broadly shared prosperity has declined. This is more the chart about relative mobility. On the x-axis, the horizontal line is parental income, and on the vertical axis is child income when they reach the same age as their parents, you know, in the 30s. And you know, you can see that that line slopes upward. That means where people end up in our society depends very heavily on where their parents were. If we really had equal opportunity for everybody, that line would be flat at the 50th percentile. And everybody would have the same opportunity to achieve a certain status in America. And that's not what this diagram shows. Now you can see there is some upward mobility for people at the bottom, right? If your household was very low income, you know, you had income in the 10, 15,000 range, you end up on average at the 30th percentile. If you're at the very, very top, 100,000 or more, people decline a little bit over time. But overwhelmingly, your parents' status still has a big effect. And we have to do a lot better than that to make sure that people coming out of homes where their parents didn't do so well make more progress in life. Now this, the third chart, is first of all about what fraction of all people who grew up in poverty or low income, say the bottom quintile, remain stuck in that bottom quintile. And it's about 34%. You might say, okay, well that's about a third. 2/3 of the people rise above poverty, except they don't rise that far. You know, most of those people who were born in and lived in poverty growing up end up somewhere in the second quintile from the bottom. They make a little progress, but not as much as we'd like to see. And it does depend very heavily on race who makes progress. So out of all people who start in the bottom, in low-income families, you can see that Asian people are the least likely to remain stuck in poverty. Only 17% remain stuck, and a lot of those low-income Asians are, in fact, immigrants. And on average, their children do quite well. 5 out of every 6 escape poverty. Notice that Latinos do about as well as whites. About 25 to 30% remain stuck, 70 to 75% move up. They may not move up that far, but they move up. But notice African Americans, and especially Native Americans, if they grow up in poverty, they're much more likely to be stuck in poverty. And so they should be a particular focus. How to improve upward mobility, not just for all low-income people, but especially the folks right now in the populations who are experiencing less of it over time. And finally, this is the fourth point I made. Mobility does seem to depend very heavily on where you live and what part of the country. And in this map, and the ones I'm going to show you about the counties, you know, the upper plain states in blue and dark green, those are the places where people are enjoying mobility. And this is from everybody starting at a certain point in life. You know, the upper plain states, people make progress. And yet the sort of southeastern corner, those red and dark orange regions, are where people remain stuck. And unfortunately, Maryland is closer to the area where a lot of people remain stuck. And we all want to change that. So some hopeful facts, but also some disturbing facts. Excuse me for a second. Okay, so let's shift gears now and move locally and focus on our 3 counties here in southern Maryland. I'll start this by showing you a few demographics and income facts. Then we'll look at geographically the mobility of children, how they look when they turn 35 on average, and then more data on child mobility by both race and gender. So these are some of the facts, and I think the facts underlying these numbers are probably familiar to most of you here. The 3 different counties by demographics and annual income and household income and individual income. Well, Calvert is the most affluent county. We all know that, right? With average incomes of about 120,000. Charles and St. Mary's are not that far behind. They are relatively affluent as well. Charles County is majority African American. I believe, and Dr. Wilson told me, the most prosperous majority African American county in America, so that's encouraging. But overall, it compared pretty comparable to St. Mary's in terms of average income and average personal income and household. Right? So individual income really is earnings in the labor market for individual people, and then household income is the parents together bringing in more of that money. So what I'm going to do is show you for each of the 3 counties separately. I'm going to start with a map like this, so you can see, and again, you all know the communities that correspond to these maps much better than I do, but show you which part of the counties do children do quite well growing up, and which part of the counties are doing less well. You're not going to see a lot of red and orange in these maps, which are the worst numbers, but you're going to see some people with the children, like in the yellower sections, end up more or less in the middle, whereas others rise higher than that. So we'll start with the maps of each county, just to show you the geography of mobility. Then I'm going to show you, on average, children who grow up in middle-income households, how are they doing when they hit age 35? Compare that to children in low-income households, how are they doing? And there's going to be 4 facts that keep jumping out at you over and over on this. Firstly, you're going to see that geography does seem to matter, right? Depending on where you grow up, your opportunities can be greater or lesser. Now, economists always make this point. Is that causation or correlation? In other words, is it really the location that's affecting people's outcomes, or the characteristics of the people who choose to live in those locations? And I think the evidence from Chetty and others is that some of both. The geography matters, the characteristics of the people matter. So we don't want to overstress that. But the second point I'm going to make is that it really matters whether you grow up in a middle income or a low income family. Every single number I'm going to show you is lower for people from lower income households and families than for middle income. Every single, without exception. Now those are averages. This is not to say that some people in low income households don't rise above the circumstances and make a lot of progress, but on average, your family background still matters a lot. Thirdly, race and gender matter a lot. And if you compare the numbers of black women relative to black men in these 3 counties, there's what to me was a shocking amount of difference, and maybe not so shocking to folks here. Black women are really, really outperforming black men on almost every dimension. And I think the status of black men in this country remains a stain on our record and on our honor. But when you look more carefully at those black women, on some levels they are doing as well or even better than their white counterparts in terms of average educational attainment income, but their household income is always lower. Always lower. And I think that has to do partly with not just their own earnings, but marriage rates and the tendency to form households that have 1 earner versus 2 earners. So all those facts I think are going to be quite apparent as I move through these charts. So let's simply start with children at age 35 whose parents were middle income, like sort of that kind of middle class kids. And we separate out whites versus black males and black females. Well, and then we look at their household incomes, their individual incomes. So what you see here is on the one hand, even out of middle income families in Calvert County, African Americans don't do as well in terms of higher ed. They lag behind in terms of higher ed. But if you look at that bottom row of individual income, they're actually doing quite well relative to whites. African Americans who live in Calvert County, even if they don't have as much higher ed, they do pretty well in the job market. And the African Americans who have chosen to live in Calvert County presumably have raised knowledge of the market, other skills they bring to the market, etc., that make them do quite well. But when you look at household income, rather than individual, you can see pretty big gaps reappear. And African Americans are more in the 30s in household income, whereas whites are 47, almost 50,000. And again, I think that has to do with partly with earnings, but also partly with household formation and whether there's one or two earners in the households. Now, these are the numbers for children who grow up in low-income households. Notice every single number is considerably lower than it was for middle-income people. Everybody growing up in low-income households, not everybody, most people, on average, have some challenges in the job market. You can see that the fractions of people obtaining higher ed are much lower, especially for African Americans, especially for black men. I'm going to show you these numbers again. Here's middle income. You see, oh, I'm sorry, that's the wrong, that's Charles County. I apologize. Notice almost 20% of African Americans getting BAs. And then here, notice only 6% of black men, 11% of black women. Just a huge drop-off in educational attainment, fairly noticeable drop-off in individual income and in household incomes for everybody, and especially for African Americans. And that's in Calvert, the most prosperous of our 3 counties. Let's now move on to Charles County. So you know the geography better. The La Plata area, sort of in the central part of the county, central and eastern part of the county, children on average are doing quite well. They're doing less well on the western side of the county. Still achieving more or less middle income status, but not as, maybe lower middle compared to the other regions. Now these are the data for Charles County from people who grow up in middle class families. Notice here, black women are doing really well in terms of higher ed attainment. On average, they are outperforming whites, and they are doing much better than black men. When it comes to individual incomes, though, despite that higher education, their individual incomes are a little bit lower, right? They're not fully translating the higher education into job market gains. Is that because of race and gender discrimination? Yeah, there's some of that. Is that because in America we haven't done very well in terms of helping women balance family life and work life, childcare? That's probably part of the story. So women doing very well in higher ed, not as well in individual income, and then you see in household income that big gap reappearing between whites and blacks. Again, because so many few of those households have fewer people working. And again, the numbers of households that have only one head instead of two, to me that goes back to the tremendous difficulties black men have in our society prospering. So it does go back to some of those social roots. But these are the middle income numbers. Now look again at children who grow up in low income in Charles County rather than middle income. Again, all of the numbers are much lower for all 3 racial groups. Notice for black females, 32% middle income, 18%. Just a huge drop-off in higher ed attainment, drop-offs in individual income, and in household incomes as well. Finally, St. Mary's County, you can see again, there's a fair amount of prosperity. The dark green are the places doing very well. Again, these are the children. When children hit 35, based on where they grow up, how well are they doing? But notice that region on the eastern side, where things are not going as well, where those children don't prosper as much. Middle-income families, children growing up in middle-income families, black females are way outperforming black males and their white counterparts. Individual income, black women, even to some extent black men doing as well as whites, but once again on household income, their numbers are a lot worse. So there are some signs of good accomplishment, good progress in these numbers, and yet other signs in all 3 counties that there's a lot of work remaining to be done, and a lot of progress still to be made. So, and again, this is comparing the low-income households to the middle income. Once again, the low-income households, the gains are much less prominent. So now let's turn then to community colleges and things here at the College of Southern Maryland. If we believe that there's a lot more progress to be made in terms of upward mobility, especially for all children growing up in lower income households and areas, especially for people of color, for African American women, and more so even for African American men, what can we do here at the College of Southern Maryland? And I'm going to use the framework of access, momentum, and mobility. It's a good framework, it's the right framework. It does capture the three sets of challenges that I think people face at community college and elsewhere. I'm going to take a step back and say, what does the research tell us? What does the research tell us about the challenges at each of those stages, especially for low-income people and people of color? And then what does it tell us about hopeful policy and practice to improve that upward mobility? Now, I'm guessing the College of Southern Maryland already does a lot of those policies and practices that make things better, but there might be some areas for improvement, and that's, again, I'm hoping to hear comments back from you on that. Okay, so I'm going to show you 6 slides. One slide on challenges in access, momentum, and mobility, and then one slide on positive, helpful policies and practices on each of those things. So we start with the challenges that people face on access. And again, the challenges are really quite serious for children who grow up low income, but sometimes even the children from middle income households face some difficulties here as well. So in terms of access to the institution, I think there's sort of 3 buckets of issues we want to think about. First of all, there's academics in high school. Let's face it, a lot of students don't do well in high school in those college prep kinds of classes, the math classes, the science classes, the basic English classes. If you have difficulties in those classes, you're likely going to have difficulty making the transition to college. There's also an information problem, because the students often don't know what do you need to know to succeed in college, whether it's at the 2-year level or at the 4-year level. A lot of students simply know you better master some of this math and some of this English material and some of the science if you want to do well. So there's the information problem. And if you haven't mastered it, what might be the pathways where you're going to succeed as opposed to others? And then career and tech ed in high schools, CTE, that has the potential to be an excellent option for people that maybe aren't quite as strong in the classroom. But unfortunately, quality of CTE in America varies a lot from one high school district. In some places they do it very well and create nice pathways into higher ed. In some pathways they don't do it as well. So some of those academic challenges combined with financial challenges. Financial aid is limited to some folks. We know, just in terms of the federal programs, Pell Grants, loans with income-based replacement, those are great options to help people pay for community college, except not everybody's eligible. If you're in a not-for-credit program at a community college, and those are often the ones most directly tied to the needs of regional industry, if you're in a not-for-credit program, you're not eligible for any Title IV assistance, no Pell Grants, no loans, etc. Or if you're in a certificate program that's short-term, 6 months or less, you're not going to be eligible for Pell Grants. And so those folks have challenges. But separately from that, a lot of our students, even younger students, have the burden of supporting families, and they have to work full-time. And therefore, they're only going to go to college part-time. The single biggest predictor of success at a community college or four-year college is whether you attend full-time or not. And I think that's something we really need to focus on, how to improve the options, especially when we get to momentum and mobility for those part-time students. And of course, the challenges of life, working out the childcare, the transportation, et cetera, are all important issues. Challenges of momentum. Well, the academic preparation remains a challenge. We force some students to take developmental education. Historically, developmental education has been something of a disaster in community colleges. If you look at some states, it actually hurts people. Their chances of finishing are lower because they get stuck in this stuff. They've been told you've got to pass algebra on a compass test. Algebra may not be necessary for whatever they're learning, and yet we force people into those areas. So sometimes developmental education can help or hurt, but people have difficulty in these key gateway classes. Like if you're interested in anything in healthcare, anatomy is really important. And a lot of people have difficulty mastering anatomy. So the gateway classes are very important. And people are missing foundational skills. Secondly, people's expectations are often a little off relative to what they're performing in the classroom. If you look at kids coming out of high school, not the adult students, look at kids coming out of high school, 80 to 90% really believe that they're going to transfer to a four-year school and get a BA. 80 to 90%. How many of them actually do that? Something closer to 20%. There's an enormous gap between people's expectations and the reality, and what I said here, the paths are non-linear. People spend a lot of time on paths where they're not really progressing. Now, not all failure is a waste, right? Because we try things, and if we fail, maybe we take a different pathway. But among community college students, there's a lot of time spent on paths they're simply not going to make progress on. There's institutional factors. How do you determine for credit versus not for credit? What's the relationship between academic and workforce? And in some way, some places, those institutional characteristics impede the not-for-credit side, the workforce side, et cetera. In some places, they work much better. And then, of course, life happens for a lot of students. Emergency economic problems, emergency health problems in their families, all these things conspire to impede momentum for a lot of students. But then what are the challenges in terms of upward mobility? And as Dr. Wilson said, upward mobility requires not just to complete a credential, but a credential with labor market value. So there's been a lot of research onto which credentials actually have that value. So I'm going to make a couple of general statements. These are averages. They're not true in every case. A terminal liberal arts degree, on average, has very little real economic value. On average. An associate's degree in history or English just doesn't boost people much in the labor market. Now, there's exceptions to that. An associate degree in math or science, an associate degree in the arts. There can be some high demand for arts education, especially in a region like Washington. But a lot of you have to be careful that people don't get stuck with these associate degrees that have no value. And on average, associate degrees are better than certificates. For credit is better than not for credit, etc. But there's a lot of variation by individual field, right? There's some short-term certificates in advanced manufacturing, in IT, even in healthcare that pay quite well, and others don't. So you've got to pay attention to the specifics. Other problems are how are the community colleges engaging with regional employers? I know in the next panel they're going to talk a lot about that. Everybody says they're engaging, but sometimes the engagement is pretty superficial. There needs to be constant feedback from the employer community to what they need the curricula to cover in their respective areas. But it's got to be a two-way street. Then the employers have to be willing to hire the people who are trained in those curricula they have pushed and to provide jobs and good-paying jobs. So it's got to be a two-way street. And we can probably improve on the transfer process as well to four-year. A lot of people get tripped up when they're trying to make that transfer. They realize they're getting a lot less credit than they thought. So the goal is to have a lot of successful pathways from which well-informed students can choose what's best for them. So those are all the challenges at all three stages, and there's a lot of them, but we know some things we can do to make this better. And I'm sure CSM is already doing some of these things. First of all, it's very important to have the community college to have ongoing outreach to the local high schools so that people are well informed about what are the pathways, what are the options, what do you need to learn in high school before you get there. And in Dr. Wilson's diagram with the hub and the 6 sets of institutions, I'm going to focus heavily on 3 of those institutions. Secondly, financial aid. We have to think of innovative ways to help fund people who may not be eligible for the federal aid for Pell Grants. And in the next panel, which my friend Rachel Lipson is going to moderate, you're going to hear innovative things going on at that community colleges to provide financial aid from other sources, and maybe some of that's happening here as well. The other thing about financial aid is work-based learning and work-study opportunities are extremely important. Internships, apprenticeships, etc., while people are in community college, really help people not just have access, but gain those opportunities in the labor market. And then the supports are very important as well. Help setting up childcare, transportation, guidance, all those things can help in access. And then momentum. If we require people to take developmental education, we have to deliver it more efficiently and more effectively. Focus on the real foundational skills, including digital literacy, that some don't have when they arrive. But in terms of the academics, we need to use data in real time to indicate exactly who's struggling in those gateway classes, and then to provide them with the appropriate supports, the tutoring, the mentoring, etc. Data can really be useful in this process. And the guidance is critically important. Dr. Wilson mentioned guided pathways, which is one model, but this idea that people should constantly be getting guidance based on their performance in the classroom about where they are most likely to succeed. And then finally, emergency cash assistance, emergency case management, help people to stay the course. Finally, for mobility, what helps on the mobility front, not just academic guidance, students need a lot more information about what's going on in the regional labor market. A lot of students really know very little about local industry, whether it's in the 3 counties or the DC metro area, and they need that information, and they need to find out what kinds of academic preparation prepare you for those jobs. Now, we have these things called American Job Centers. There's 3,000 of them around the country. We used to call them one-stops. They provide people this information. It turns out the majority of community college students never set foot in a one-stop. So maybe we should help them more to get that information. Maybe we should co-locate more of those one-stops on campus, and maybe you're already doing some of that. People need the labor market information as well as the academic information. Stackable credentials and pathways are very important. Everybody's doing it. I know you're doing some of that here. Here's the problem is actually very few students choose to stack. If you look at the fraction of people who get a certificate, it's actually a quite small fraction of them, maybe 20% in the national data, who then move on a pathway, a stackable pathway. So the question is, why aren't they? Well, they probably have so many home and family responsibilities that once they finish, they can't keep moving on. But we got to find out what are the barriers to more of that, and how can we help people along. Engagement with local employers needs to be both broad and deep. The local employer community, and I know some of you in the room, need to constantly be telling the community colleges, this is what we need the curriculum to cover if we want people to succeed in our industry. But again, it's got to be a two-way street. But they got to turn around and provide the work-based learning opportunities for students, the job opportunities, etc. The two got to go hand in hand. And finally, on transfers, the pathways, the articulation, making sure students get as much credit as possible, that's important too, and can be improved on. So let me wrap up. Can the College of Southern Maryland raise mobility, especially for students growing up in these low-income households? I'm sure the answer is yes. My sense, the little bit I've learned, is that you're already doing quite a good job. There's probably some areas of improvement, understanding both the strengths and the weaknesses of these counties, understanding those challenges, not only what the challenges are, but exactly who faces those challenges, and then targeting the right assistance to those people, whoever needs it and wherever they need it. All those different, whether it's in developmental ed, whether it's in gateway classes, whether it's in trying to connect with local industry, target the right assistance to where the challenges are. Community colleges have to stay in constant touch. Here I have 3 of the 6 institutions in the hub with high schools that communicate what's needed, with local 4-year institutions to make sure that the transfers go more smoothly, and very, very importantly, with local employers. And the institutional strengths, the pathways, the guidance have to both be there, academic as well as workforce, and we have to build on those successes. You know, we asked community colleges in America to wear a lot of hats. I don't know of any other academic institution that is responsible for academic progress, workforce progress, so many students from varied backgrounds with so many different ranges of abilities and interests. And it's not like we give them that much funding and that much resources to do all these things successfully. That's the challenge, right? That when students come in, that they face a range of possibly successful pathways where they can choose the one best for themselves based on good information and on their performance. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to now I want to hear from all of you and learn what you know more than I do on what's happening locally. But thank you very much.
So thank you, Harry, for that very informative and relevant presentation. We are going to now open the room for questions and answers. So Dr. Piper and I will be coming to you with the microphone. So when you have a question, raise your hand and we'll come to you. So let's get started. Sandy.
Closer.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, when you showed the data, you did not separate white men and female. It was aggregate. So why was that?
You're exactly right. And I was worried that the chart would look too cluttered if there were too many columns, but you're right. And of course, the truth is, women are outperforming men in higher education in every racial group in America, in every class group, and indeed all around the industrial world. So you're right, that if I had broken down race by gender, you would see white females doing better than white males, probably doing better than African American females as well. But the same problem when it comes to translating the higher ed credentials into earnings and income, some of the same shortfall, except with the difference that the white females are much more likely than black females to live in a household with 2 earners rather than 1 earner. But your basic point is correct, and maybe it would have been worth having decluttering so you can make sure you're comparing apples to apples. But it is this interesting point. Men are doing much less well in higher education. And again, you find that everywhere in the world. And so how does a community college deal with that particular challenge faced by all of the men? And other challenges faced by the women. Like it's clear that, really America ranks near the bottom in terms of our assistance with things like child care and parental leave. I mean, it's a terrible report. So those things often inhibit women from translating their higher ed into gains. Also occupational segregation. I mean, from the get-go, women are still steered into some fields and not others. Those old stereotypes live on, less than they used to be. So white women do face some of the same success, some of the same challenges, and some different.
Good morning. Would it be fair to say that to add something to raising mobility would also be to look at how the metrics are looked at and to change these metrics? Because it seems like, for our community colleges, naturally they're funded via state funding, local funding, things like that. And a lot of those metrics sometimes are based on basic things like, 2-year graduation rates and stuff like that. But I wonder if the metrics, when you want to look outside the box, so to say, to train folks in other areas like AI or advanced manufacturing, they're not looked at so highly. Hence, you're not trying to meet the core goal, which has got to be funded, but that gets skewed. See kind of where I'm going with that? It's like changing that to help them raise mobility.
I think I understand what you're saying. First of all, you're right that, and I try to make this point, completion, it really depends on what we're completing. And it's relevant to regional industries for the people that are not moving on to 4-year, which is most people. So it depends, number one, which industries people are trained for. Of course, we want to give people also a general background so they're not locked in to any specific industry. But you're also right. So a lot of the people, and maybe this is what you're hinting at, a lot of the courses that prepare people for specific industries are certificate programs, sometimes not for credit, sometimes short-term, that may not, in fact, be eligible for financial aid. We do need a more granular analysis, I think, of the data. It often depends on which data. And by the way, the data are massively better after Raj Chetty than before, because they figured out more ways of matching people's IRS forms and their Social Security forms. But I imagine here it's really important to look at a granular way at the local industries and what are people finishing and what kind of aid are they getting in order to do that, and who's facing financial burdens and trying to get that and which are not. So I think you're right. We need better data on funding, on outcomes, and on who's doing better based on which of those credentials they earn.
Good morning. Across the country, there's been a movement to get more early college programs happening with the high schools. I'm curious if you have any data on students who are impacted by poverty, who take advantage of those programs and their ability to complete a 2-year and perhaps transition effectively to a 4-year degree and complete that.
Those data are not widely available. I see very little that's published by public sources on that. There have been some studies. The studies all show that taking that path is a good thing, that it helps people, gives them the momentum to finish something at community college, sometimes even at 4-year. I think it's also true that people from low-income backgrounds face more challenges in doing that because they also face all these challenges with academic preparation, home and family responsibilities, etc. So I think that's what the data show. It's a positive thing. Low-income people still have more challenges with that pathway as with all others. But I think it's an important thing to be aware of because it is, if you can manage to do that and do it successfully, it does give you a boost at 2-year institutions, 4-year institutions. So it is something we want to find out. What are the challenges limiting lower income kids from accessing those programs or doing well once they're in them?
So the Community College Research Center, which is for community colleges, our primary source of research on questions that we're asking, has shown that 80% of schools, public schools in this country, have unrepresentative early college dual enrollment opportunities for students to take college classes in high school, and they're unrepresentative by gender, they're unrepresented by race and ethnicity, they're unrepresented by socioeconomic status. But we know, as Professor Holzer said, that students who engage in these programs enroll in college at higher rates, complete college at higher rates, transfer at higher rates, and complete baccalaureate degrees at higher rates. So that early opportunity to be focused on the assets you bring, the diverse populations assets that they bring to these programs is really critical. States like Massachusetts and Texas, ironically, have non-selective dual enrollment, which means that everybody is eligible to participate in dual enrollment programs. Maryland, for example, historically has had selective admission into those programs, so you had to have certain grades to be able to qualify for dual enrollment. States like Texas, where they have and Massachusetts, where they have represented dual enrollment, see that students of color, women, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds do as well as white and Asian students when given the opportunity to enroll in the programs. So the challenge we have is not student performance in the programs, but opening up the access. So it's the whole issue of disconnected populations, and in some cases we're seeing, in the case of Momentum as well, that students who have been disconnected from these programs in the past benefit more from them than white and Asian students. So I think we know what the problem is, but it's a policy issue as well. CSM can't solve this problem on their own. They had the early college program we ran last year, which was diverse along a number of different criteria. It was showed similar results, very successful results. But changing the dual enrollment or early college policies statewide requires community partners working with the legislators to understand that the data says that more representative enrollment leads to better results.
Okay, let's go. Now everybody's really looking.
Test. Good morning. So maybe a little bit of Captain Obvious question.
but why not, what are the Asians doing right? And not only are they doing it right here in the United States, but also globally. So how about a little analysis there, cut and paste across the other social, races and whatnot, to try to, maybe mimic that and, across the entire group where you could, and it'd probably have to go over generations or something like that, but what are the Asians doing right?
So ask a challenging question. Of course, 2 generations ago, it was my ethnic group, children of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, that were doing really well. So you always have this challenge. Well, why do some people do better than others? It is not biology. Absolutely, it's not biology. Some people use the word culture, which I'm a little uncomfortable with also, because it implies some cultures are better than others. But remember, these are mostly the students of immigrants, whereas lower income African Americans and Latinos are much more likely to be children of native-born people whose families may have been low income for generations. Immigrants, most immigrant groups, the children do quite well in America. They catch up with the average in one generation. They often exceed the average in the second generation. So part of it is simply the success of immigrant communities and which folks choose to migrate to America. And I think whatever it is that impels some Asian folks to move to the United States, it's often folks with strong basic skills and with a strong interest in pursuing higher education, especially in science and technology. And again, some of that is cultural, some of it is background, but some of it reflects simply who chooses to migrate to America. Whereas, for instance, if you look at Latino immigrants, they're coming from a much lower income background, education background. Where do you think that go? From their home countries. The people coming from Asia often come with some solid education background, some business background. But in those families, there's a very strong emphasis on academic performance, on employment. They are almost always 2-parent families, and we have too many 1-parent families in America. But again, I link that back to the difficulties that Black men have in our society, especially less educated Black men. By the way, the single-parent phenomenon is growing very rapidly in the white community as well. The white working class, the numbers are hugely going that way. But I think it's that combination. People coming with sufficient background, a set of themes in the household that emphasizes academic performance, 2-parent background, solid, safe background, and all the right messages to the kids. Again, it's not biology, and it does have to do with who chooses to move to America in the first place. But you're right, there are probably lessons to be learned from their success, which maybe can be emulated in others, in households and communities and so.
Hey, thank you. Good morning. I'm Steve Anthony from NSWC Indian Head, and as a true scientist at heart, I really appreciate all the data. So here's a question as I'm thinking about it. You were talking about early on just about the differences, like going full time versus part time, right? So what I would be interested in, maybe you pull this data, is how does that pull back, like maximizing remote opportunities for learning, and what that looks like to potentially minimize that delta. But also, I'm also very sensitive, what we alluded to already about like with COVID and everything like that, there is always a balance too, and a social cohesion balance too, that is an intangible flavor that comes in. But I'd be interested in hearing if there's some data that's been showing what that looks like, and if you looked at it in your calculus. Thanks.
You mean the potential role of remote learning?
Remote learning, and potentially how that has potentially minimized whatever deltas that you've seen holistically over that, and if that has been more, if you've seen it lower.
So I haven't seen broad numbers of applied populations, maybe Susan, you have. I think, so we know that remote education was a disaster for K-12 kids, and especially for lower income K-12, total disaster. I think at community colleges and some four-year, it's not as bad, because again, the people who are taking it have more maturity, perhaps more focus, et cetera. If we could learn to do it well, it would be a great thing. It would dramatically improve access. And like you said, especially for the people, and some people have to work full-time, right? They just no option, right? And so we can make that access better for them. But we haven't gotten to the place, I think, where we really do it well. And and your remarks kind of suggest it's the right mix of remote and human touch, the right mix of supports. For instance, there's a big movement underway to develop what they call intelligent tutoring systems, AI-driven tutoring, which should make the remote work more successful. We're on the road to developing those programs. We're not there yet, but I think it's still, and even if you look at people in those systems, there still is a need for some human touch. Even the best AI-driven systems will do some things right. So we're trying to figure out that mix, and I think you're right. When we develop that mix, it will improve access for this. And what you're seeing is in some of the very best job training programs, including the ones not even on community college campuses, some of them are switching to remote instruction for some pieces of what they deliver. And it's actually bringing the costs way down and making successful programs more affordable. So I'm hopeful about the ability of remote access to lower costs and raise access. We're not quite there yet, but it's an important thing to keep working on.
Good morning.
Right.
Thank you so much. This information has been impactful. My name is Dawn Tucker, and I have a government contracting business here in Southern Maryland. I have been raised here in Southern Maryland through the public school system. So being able to compare where I came from is very helpful in being able to move forward. And I'm sure several of us here in the room can definitely relate. But my question is, or comment is, now that we have like the next flood of funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law and the CHIPS Act, and even here in Maryland, the need to support the Maryland blueprint, and I see that we have our superintendents and other folks here. Have you done some more analysis and connecting the dots, if you will, on how we can use to funnel that money down into the community colleges, but also into our community-based organizations, and several of us represent those types of organizations? That type of information would be helpful also towards our strategic planning.
I think that's an enormously important question. So many parts of workforce development are sort of starved for funds. And in those three major bills, infrastructure, green energy, and CHIPS, there is a lot of money being allocated. But I don't know that folks have figured out exactly how to get that money out to where it's needed, to identify what are, for all that stuff to be successful, if you don't have the properly trained workers, those efforts are going to fail. So it's a critical piece, not just for the communities, but for the success of the programs. And I think the people are trying to figure that out. Now, I'll tell you a little secret. Rachel Lipson is going to moderate the next panel, is the person in charge of workforce development for the CHIPS Act at the Commerce Department. She doesn't mind me saying that, but that means that workforce development is in very capable hands. But I think they're trying to figure that out as they go along. It's just going to be a big challenge. They're going to be short on a lot of skilled workers. We have people in the community who need those skills, but how to get the money down to where it's needed and how to make sure it's spent effectively, I think will be a big challenge. But I do encourage all the community organizations and all the community colleges to try to get into that game because it's a very important one. I'm glad you raised it. Thank you.
And Dawn, that might be a question when Rachel moderates the panel. Rachel could have been here with us today, but she's in New York. Why don't you ask that question because there'll be a Q&A at the end of that, and I'd love to get her thoughts about that. Okay.
And don't tell her that I was the one that passed on.
Good morning, Down Wood, I'm I have a private major consulting firm here in Southern Maryland, and I chair the Chamber of Commerce and Business Education Committee. I like numbers, I like the numbers. It didn't jump out at me that there was white ethnic groups were, put together, black and white men were separated. My
Certainly in the first question, yes, I'm happy to make my slides available. I think I drew all my data either from Opportunity Insights, which does get down to county level, or from the Census Bureau. And they do provide data by race and gender. But if you're talking about ethnicities within racial groups, I think less so. That's my recollection. But it's enormously interesting and useful data. So I encourage everybody, and they're very accessible. I mean, I had never used them before. Dr. Wilson encouraged me to look at them and to draw. And they're very, very interesting and useful. So I don't think they have that cut, but they do have a lot of cuts that I find very interesting.
If you Google Opportunity Insights, you'll see the database of economic tracker. That's
Yeah,
really fine.
and you go to the atlas, yeah, go to the atlas.
Play with it. I'm sorry.
If you Google Opportunity Insights, you'll see the economic data tracker, and you can just kind of play with it a bit and be able to kind of disaggregate by county, gender, race, et cetera.
Opportunity what?
Insights. INSIGHTS.
So we have time for about 2, maybe 3 more questions.
Good morning, Evelyn Bryant Ward. And so my question is, you talked about academic guidance, and I see a lot of students are lost between finishing high school and even getting to the community college level. What are the academic guidance counselors doing at the high school level to make sure that we are engaging these students and providing them with resources and information to help them want to identify where their area of expertise lie and what, job opportunities exist for them based upon that? Because I think that that's really important, but they may not get to the college guidance level to get that information. So how are our guidance counselors engaged at high school?
It's a hugely important question. And my guess is that, like everything else, guidance counselors vary enormously in terms of their skill, their basic knowledge. From my experience, they focus a lot more on academically successful kids rather than the folks you're talking about. But I would say, you can't expect too much from our guidance counselors either. I think young people should start learning about the labor market in middle school. And, right? I mean, in the 6th grade, by the time you're 6th grade, you should have some sense of what you need to learn in order to be successful in the labor market. How many young people know that if you don't learn algebra and some of that middle school math, you can't get a job as a machinist or as a precision welder or some of those other high-tech, well-paying jobs. So if people had that information early on, it might change their motivation in those subsequent years to do better, right? With a little more of a goal for themselves.
But you're saying if they have that information, how do we expect them to get that information?
No, I think the schools have to provide that. And like I said, I think it can't all be on the shoulders of the guidance counselor because their load is already pretty high. I think the schools there has to be more career education starting in middle school. People have to have a better sense of what you need to know. Now, everybody has their pet thing, right, that they want the middle schools and the high schools. I just think this is a big one to leave out. And so I would love to see just more focus on career labor market information so students are better informed. And then some places have developed good career and tech ed and good pathways from CTE into community college programs. But people have some better sense of whether that might be. And the other thing we want to be careful, let's be honest, there's been a lot of tracking in American history. And minority kids and lower income kids get tracked away from academics when they are capable. We don't want that either. We want to let people know what are the pathways available to them, how they have to perform, and at the end of each of those pathways, what might be some of the jobs. Guidance counselors can help, but they can't do it all.
I've asked Dr. Navarro, Superintendent of Charles County Public Schools, to speak on this new initiative.
So Andre and I are here, and I think our third wheel is coming in a little bit later, but I wanted to address that issue. So we talked a little bit about the blueprint. One of the things that we are all working on, and actually with the College of Southern Maryland, is we now have career counselors in the middle school. We started that. We needed to, you know, when I talk to my middle school families, I'm like, you need to understand that high school is completely changing. When we started doing early college programs and getting really focused on parents and students understanding that in a way, high school, you have to really be thinking about high school as your gateway to what you're going to do next. So we're excited to bring in career counselors. Actually, the 3 school districts work together to have MOUs that are aligned. We have workforce development also that is here. And so we are really, really committed to starting in that middle school years, talking to families and students around interest survey, understanding the things you like to do, how do you understand what jobs are available, how do we understand what jobs are going to be created that we don't even know about. So we started that work here. I'm really excited because I think we finish each other's sentences. We do battle when it comes to athletics and academic activities, but we collaborate immensely, and CSM brings us together in so many ways around thinking about the prosperity of the region and not just thinking locally. So
That's very, very true.
Thank you very much, Dan Moore. Just want to get your comments about this. I had the opportunity recently through Toxic Partnership to be a judge for the JSHS Fair, and we had 19 students from high school that were mind-blowingly amazing. And to me, I was intrigued by what the secret sauce was. And your data on the Asians and what they do there kind of resonated with that, and just resonated with some of my own experiences, because I got to interview pretty much every one of them. And there was some common threads, I thought, that I took away anecdotally, okay? Number one is they have great parental support, no doubt about it. The public school system they were in really supported them well. They had friends that thought academics were cool and valuable, right? They were motivated, no doubt. Their attitude was awesome. They had internships where they got that professional exposure. But going back to my own personal experiences making it through engineering, one of the few people of all my friends that did, mindset and attitude, transcends culture and everything else. So just having that, I'll say, opportunity growth mindset, that the possibilities are unlimited for the future, I think is something that can transcend all cultures. But people have to, mindset and attitude has a lot to do with our success, competitiveness in sports and things like that. You don't believe you're going to win, you're not going to win. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
That sounds right to me. It does resonate with my personal experience, those of my friends. Social networks, actually some of Raj Chen's most recent work is that those social networks are enormously important in terms of who from those low-income backgrounds actually makes it. Now, those things are hard to change from a policy point of view, and if the parents aren't generating it, we can't invent social networks, right? They form organically. But I think community institutions can play a very important role in something like that, right? In terms of trying to get the message out, in addition to what people get from parents, et cetera. And making sure that kids have the opportunities to try to develop those networks in school. So it's hard to do. It's hard to do, but I think the community-based organizations and our religious institutions might be in best position to try to get some of those messages out.
Can we better inform the parents?
You can. Some parents' lives are very, very difficult, right? Single parents trying to raise kids on a fairly low income, got a lot on their plate. So, right, it's worth trying, but we can't necessarily criticize the parents that can't quite get to that, we're just trying to get the next meal on the table. So expect something from parents, but maybe supplement it with these other things, community institutions, et cetera.
Great, so thank you all for your very thoughtful questions. And let's